It was 2:15 in the morning when I realized that everything I thought I knew about life and medicine was about to change forever. I had been standing in the hallway of Emory University Hospital for what felt like hours, staring at the surgical schedule on my tablet. 12 years as an anesthesiologist had taught me to read between the lines of these cold clinical entries. But this one case, room 7, scheduled for 3:30, carried a weight that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt since my residency days. Sarah Williams, 47 years old, mother of 2, high-risk abdominal surgery. Those simple words on the screen told a story that statistics couldn't capture. Behind that name was a woman who had kissed her children goodnight just hours earlier, not knowing if she would ever see them wake up again. Behind those clinical terms was a family sitting in our waiting room, holding on to each other like their lives depended on it. I've always prided myself on emotional control. In my line of work, you have to. When someone's life hangs in the balance of the medications you administer, when their breathing depends on the precise calculations you make, there's no room for sentiment. You become a machine of precision, a guardian of consciousness who works in the shadows while surgeons get the glory. But that night felt different from the moment I walked through those automatic doors. The hospital corridors were quieter than usual, with only the soft hum of ventilation systems and the distant beeping of monitors creating a symphony that had become the soundtrack of my career. I knew every sound, every rhythm, every pattern that these machines could produce. They were my language, my compass in the chaos of operating rooms, where seconds could mean the difference between a family celebrating or mourning. As I made my way toward the pre-op area, I caught a glimpse of the Williams family through the waiting room's glass doors. Marcus Williams sat with his shoulders hunched forward, his large hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His daughter Jasmine, 16, according to the chart, was curled up in the chair beside him, her head resting on his shoulder while tears streamed silently down her cheeks. Their son Caleb, just 14, paced back and forth by the window, his young face carrying a burden no teenager should have to bear. That image burned itself into my memory. In all my years of medicine, I had learned to compartmentalize these moments. Families in crisis were part of the landscape, background noise to the real work happening in sterile rooms down the hall. But something about the Williams family broke through my professional armor. Maybe it was the way Marcus kept checking his phone, hoping for updates that wouldn't come for hours. Maybe it was how Jasmine clutched a small teddy bear, clearly something she'd outgrown but brought for comfort. Or perhaps it was Caleb's restless energy, the same nervous pacing I'd seen in my own son when he was worried about something beyond his control. I had to look away. The pre-op area was bustling with the controlled chaos I'd grown accustomed to. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, checking IV lines and monitoring vital signs. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from the break room, creating an oddly comforting combination that meant home to me after more than a decade in these halls. But tonight, even familiar comforts felt hollow. I pulled up Sarah's chart on the computer terminal, scanning through her medical history with a thoroughness that had become second nature. The numbers told a concerning story. Her condition was complicated, the surgery necessary but dangerous. Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, our chief surgeon, was excellent, one of the best I'd worked with, but even his skilled hands couldn't overcome certain biological realities. The success rate for this type of procedure, given Sarah's specific complications, hovered around 60%. In medical terms, those were reasonable odds. In human terms, it meant there was a very real chance that Marcus Williams would be going home alone, that Jasmine and Caleb would be growing up without their mother. I closed the chart and checked my watch. 3 o'clock. Sarah would be coming down from her room in 30 minutes, and I needed to be ready. Ready with the right medications, the right dosages, the right words to calm her fears before we put her under. Ready to hold her life in my hands while Dr. Mitchell worked to save her. But as I prepared my equipment, running through the mental checklist that had become automatic after thousands of procedures, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was going to be different. Not because of the medical complexity. I'd handled more challenging situations before. Not because of the family dynamics. Every case involved people who loved the patient desperately. This felt different because something deep in my gut, some instinct honed by years of witnessing the thin line between life and loss, was telling me that I was about to see something that would challenge everything I thought I understood about medicine, About life, about the mysteries that exist in the spaces between heartbeats. I had no idea how right I was, and I certainly had no idea that by dawn, I would be questioning not just my medical training, but my entire understanding of what's possible when hope collides with science in the most unexpected ways. The intercom crackled to life. Dr. Hayes to room 7 for pre-op consultation. As I walked toward that room, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway, I felt like I was walking towards something that would change me forever. I just didn't know that the most unbelievable case of my career was about to prove that some moments transcend everything we think we know about the boundaries between medicine and miracle. When I pushed open the door to room 7, I expected to find another anxious patient, someone I could comfort with practiced words before we moved to the operating room. What I found instead was Sarah Williams sitting upright in her hospital bed, her hands folded calmly in her lap, looking directly at me with the clearest, most peaceful eyes I'd ever seen in a pre-op room. "You must be Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady and warm despite everything she was facing. "I've been waiting for you." There was something about her presence that immediately caught me off guard. In 12 years of doing pre-op consultations, I had encountered every type of patient reaction imaginable. Panic, denial, anger, desperate bargaining, stoic acceptance. But Sarah Williams radiated something I rarely saw in these circumstances: genuine peace. She was smaller than I had imagined from reading her chart, with shoulder-length brown hair that she had braided simply to keep it out of the way. Her hospital gown looked oversized on her petite frame, but her posture was erect, dignified. What struck me most was her smile. It wasn't the forced brightness that people often wore like armor when they were terrified. This was real, and it reached her eyes in a way that made me pause in the doorway for just a moment longer than professional. "Mrs. Williams," I said, moving to the chair beside her bed and pulling out my tablet. "I'm here to go over your anesthesia plan and answer any questions you might have before we head to surgery." She nodded, but instead of immediately asking about the procedure, the usual first question, she looked at me with genuine curiosity. "Dr. Hayes, can I ask you something? How long have you been doing this?" 12 years, I answered automatically, then found myself adding, "Why do you ask?" "You look tired," she said simply, with the kind of directness that only comes from someone who has learned to value honesty above politeness. But not just physically tired. Like you're carrying something heavy. I stopped typing on my tablet and looked up at her, completely taken aback. Patients didn't usually analyze their anesthesiologists. They were typically too focused on their own fears to notice anything about the medical staff beyond whether we seemed competent. "Mrs. Williams," I started, trying to redirect the conversation back to medical territory where I felt safe. "Let's focus on you right now. How are you feeling about the surgery?" She was quiet for a moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "I'm not afraid," she said finally. "I probably should be, given what the surgeon told me about the risks. But I'm not." That's good," I said, though her calm was so unexpected it almost seemed concerning. "Sometimes patients do better when they're not anxious. Your blood pressure and heart rate are more stable, which makes my job easier." Sarah smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "I don't think it's that simple, Dr. Hayes. I think there are some things that happen in operating rooms that have nothing to do with blood pressure or heart rate." Now I was definitely uncomfortable. I had learned early in my career to keep conversations with patients focused on concrete medical facts. Venturing into philosophical territory was dangerous. It opened doors to discussions about hope and faith, and all the messy emotions that could complicate what needed to be a purely clinical interaction. "Mrs. Williams," I said carefully, "I want you to know that you're in excellent hands. Dr. Mitchell is one of our best surgeons, and I've worked with him on dozens of similar cases. We're going to take very good care of you." She reached over and touched my hand, a gesture so unexpected that I nearly pulled away. Her fingers were warm, steady. "I know you will," she said. "But that's not what I'm talking about." Before I could respond, she continued, "Dr. Hayes, do you have children?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I did have children, 2 boys, 8 and 10 years old. And suddenly I was seeing this whole situation through a completely different lens. Sarah Williams wasn't just a patient with a concerning medical history. She was someone's mother, Someone who tucked her kids in at night and helped them with homework and worried about whether they were making good choices. Yes, I said quietly. 2 boys. Then you understand, she said, her voice taking on a tone of gentle certainty. You understand what it means to know that someone needs you to come home. That's not medical, Dr. Hayes. That's something else entirely. I felt my professional composure wavering in a way that hadn't happened in years. There was something about Sarah Williams that cut through all the clinical distance I had carefully constructed. She wasn't just accepting her situation, she was absolutely certain about something, and that certainty was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Mrs. Williams, I said, trying to regain my footing, I need to go over your medical history and explain what will happen during the anesthesia process. Of course, she agreed readily. But first, can I tell you something about my children? I should have said no. I should have redirected her back to medical topics. But something in her tone made me nod instead. Jasmine. She's 16. She's been taking care of everyone since I got sick. Making sure Caleb does his homework, helping Marcus with dinner, organizing my medications. She's trying so hard to be the adult because she's afraid I won't be there to do it anymore. Sarah's voice remained steady, but I could see the emotion in her eyes. And Caleb, he pretends he's not scared, but he crawls into our bed every night and sleeps between Marcus and me. He hasn't done that since he was 6. I found myself leaning forward, completely drawn into her story despite myself. They need their mom, Dr. Hayes, not just for the big things, but for the little things, for the way I make pancakes on Sunday mornings, with chocolate chips and smiley faces, for the way I sing off-key in the car and make them laugh even when they're embarrassed, for the way I know exactly what to say when Jasmine has her heart broken, or when Caleb strikes out in baseball. Her voice grew stronger, more certain. That's why I'm not afraid. Because I know, I absolutely know, that I'm going to be there for all of those moments. I can feel it in a place deeper than fear, deeper than statistics, deeper than medical charts. I stared at her, completely unprepared for this level of conviction. In my experience, patients who were unreasonably optimistic often had the worst outcomes. Denial could be dangerous when it prevented people from facing medical realities. But this didn't feel like denial. This felt like something else entirely. Mrs. Williams, I said carefully, I admire your positive attitude. But I want you to understand that this is a serious procedure with real risks. We're going to do everything possible to ensure the best outcome, but you can't guarantee anything, she finished for me. I know that, Dr. Hayes. I'm not naive about the medical reality. I've read every piece of literature the surgeon gave me. I understand the statistics. She paused, looking directly into my eyes. But there are some things that exist outside of statistics. Some promises that get made in places deeper than operating rooms. And I've received one of those promises. The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of the monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital coming to life as the night shift prepared for the busiest hours before dawn. I found myself completely at a loss for words, caught between my medical training that demanded I prepare her for the worst-case scenario, and something indefinable that was telling me Sarah Williams knew something I didn't. Dr. Hayes, she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. I need you to promise me something. What's that? When you're in that operating room, when you're monitoring my vitals and making sure I'm stable, I need you to watch for something beyond what the machines can tell you. I need you to be open to the possibility that some things happen that can't be measured or explained. I should have deflected this request with professional platitudes about focusing on evidence-based medicine. Instead, I heard myself saying, "What kind of things?" Sarah smiled, and for a moment the room seemed brighter. You'll know when you see it. And when you do, I need you to remember that Jasmine and Caleb and Marcus are waiting for me. They're expecting me to come home. And sometimes, Dr. Hayes, expectations like that have a power that your machines can't measure. A knock on the door interrupted us. Nurse Lisa Johnson poked her head in. Dr. Hayes, we're ready for Mrs. Williams in OR 3. As I stood up to leave, Sarah reached for my hand again. Thank you for listening to me talk about my children. I know that's not usually part of the anesthesia consultation. No, I admitted. It's not. But I'm glad you did. And as I walked out of that room, preparing to gather my equipment and head to the operating room, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my career, I was walking into surgery not just as a doctor managing medications and monitoring vital signs, but as someone who had been entrusted with a mother's absolute certainty that she would be going home to make Sunday morning pancakes with chocolate chip smiley faces. I had no idea that her words were about to become the lens through which I would witness something that would shatter every assumption I had ever made about the boundaries between medicine and miracles. 20 minutes later, as we wheeled Sarah Williams into operating room 3, I found myself watching her face instead of my monitors for the first time in my career. Most patients at this point were either heavily sedated from pre-medication or visibly anxious as the reality of surgery hit them. Sarah was neither. She was alert, calm, and when she saw me adjusting my equipment, she actually winked. "Remember what I told you, Dr. Hayes," she said softly, as Nurse Lisa Johnson began connecting her to the monitoring devices. "Keep your eyes open for more than just numbers." Dr. Jonathan Mitchell entered the OR at exactly 4 o'clock, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. Jonathan was a surgeon's surgeon, methodical, confident, with steady hands that had saved more lives than I could count. But as he reviewed Sarah's chart one final time, I noticed something I'd never seen before. A slight hesitation in his movements, a barely perceptible tightness around his eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice carrying its usual professional warmth. "How are we feeling?" "Ready to get home to my children," she replied without missing a beat. "They're expecting pancakes tomorrow morning." Jonathan smiled, but I caught him glancing at me with an expression that said we both knew how complicated this was going to be. Sarah's condition was more severe than we had initially thought. The scans from yesterday afternoon had revealed additional complications that made an already risky procedure significantly more dangerous. As I began the process of administering anesthesia, I found myself thinking about our conversation in her room. Sarah's absolute certainty that she would wake up stood in stark contrast to the medical reality we were facing. Her blood pressure was higher than I liked, her heart rate showed irregularities that concerned me, and the latest lab results indicated that her body was already under significant stress before we even began. "Mrs. Williams," I said, leaning close as she began to feel the effects of the medication, "I want you to count backwards from 10 for me." 10, she said clearly, her eyes still focused on mine with that same peaceful certainty. 9, 8. "Dr. Hayes, remember what I said about my children. 7. They need me to come home. 6. Her voice faded as the anesthesia took hold, but her last words hung in the air like a challenge to everything I thought I knew about the relationship between hope and medicine. The surgery began at 4:23 in the morning. From my position at the head of the table, I had a clear view of everything, the monitors displaying Sarah's vital signs, Dr. Mitchell's precise movements as he began the procedure, the controlled chaos of nurses anticipating his every need. This was the environment where I had spent thousands of hours, where I had become an expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated whether a patient was stable or sliding toward crisis. And from the very beginning, those signs were troubling. Sarah's blood pressure was fluctuating more than I liked, requiring constant adjustments to her medication. Her heart rate would spike unexpectedly, then drop to levels that made me reach for emergency drugs, only to normalize again just as I was about to intervene. It was as if her body couldn't decide whether it wanted to fight or surrender. "How are we doing up there, Ben?" Dr. Mitchell asked without looking up from his work. We had developed a shorthand over the years. He knew exactly what my responses meant. "Unstable," I replied, my eyes never leaving the monitors. "Blood pressure's all over the place. Heart rate's erratic. I'm managing it, but she's not making this easy." What I didn't say was that something felt fundamentally different about this case. In my experience, patients whose bodies were struggling this much during the early stages of surgery rarely improved as the procedure progressed. Usually they got worse, sometimes significantly worse. 30 minutes into the surgery, Dr. Mitchell encountered the first major complication. "We've got more scar tissue than the imaging showed," he announced, his voice maintaining its professional calm despite the concern I could hear underneath. "This is going to take longer than anticipated." Longer meant more stress on Sarah's already struggling system. Longer meant more anesthesia, more time for things to go wrong, more opportunities for the kind of cascade failure that every anesthesiologist dreaded. I increased her pain medication and adjusted her blood pressure support, but I could feel the familiar weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Sarah Williams was deteriorating, slowly but unmistakably, and there wasn't much I could do about it beyond managing the symptoms and hoping her body could endure whatever Dr. Mitchell needed to do. "Second unit of blood ready?" Dr. Mitchell called out. "Standing by," Nurse Johnson replied, and I felt my heart sink a little further. We had anticipated possible blood loss, but needing the second unit this early was not a good sign. As the minutes ticked by, I found myself thinking about Jasmine and Caleb Williams, probably still in the waiting room with their father. Did they know how serious this was? Had anyone explained to them that their mother's body was fighting a battle on multiple fronts, that her vital signs were telling a story of a system under siege? "Dr. Hayes," Nurse Johnson said quietly, pointing to one of my monitors. "Her oxygen saturation's dropping." I looked at the screen and felt my stomach clench. Sarah's blood oxygen levels were falling despite the ventilator doing its job perfectly. Her lungs were struggling to process the oxygen I was giving her, another sign that her body was reaching the limits of its ability to cope with the trauma of surgery. I adjusted her ventilator settings and increased the oxygen concentration, watching the numbers with the intensity of someone whose patient's life depended on every decision. The levels stabilized but barely, hovering just above the threshold that would indicate serious respiratory distress. "Talk to me, Ben," Dr. Mitchell said, and I could hear the tension in his voice now. He had hit another complication, something that was taking longer to resolve than he had hoped. "She's hanging in there," I said, which was technically true, but didn't capture the full picture of how precarious things were becoming. "But she's using up all her reserves. We need to move as quickly as possible." What I was really thinking was that Sarah Williams was dying. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. Her body was shutting down system by system, and despite all my training, all my experience, all my equipment, I was watching it happen with a growing sense of helplessness. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a woman who had spoken with absolute certainty about going home to make pancakes for her children, and her body was telling me that she might not even survive the next hour. At 47 minutes into the surgery, her heart rate suddenly spiked to dangerous levels. "Tachycardia," I announced, reaching immediately for the medication that might bring it down. Heart rate 140 and climbing. Dr. Mitchell's hands never paused in their work, but I saw his jaw tighten. "How bad?" "Bad enough," I replied, injecting the medication and watching the monitors with laser focus. "Come on, Sarah," I found myself whispering under my breath. "Your kids are waiting for those pancakes." The medication worked, but only partially. Her heart rate came down to levels that wouldn't cause immediate damage, but it remained elevated, another sign that her cardiovascular system was struggling to keep up with the demands we were placing on it. And then, at 51 minutes into the surgery, everything started falling apart at once. Her blood pressure crashed without warning, dropping so fast that the alarms on my machines created a symphony of urgent beeping. Simultaneously, her heart rhythm became irregular. The steady pattern I had been monitoring replaced by chaotic spikes and valleys that indicated her heart was losing its ability to pump effectively. "We're losing her," I called out, my hands moving automatically to prepare the emergency medications that might buy us more time. "Blood pressure's bottoming out, cardiac arrhythmia, possible heart failure." Dr. Mitchell looked up from his work for the first time since the surgery began, and in that moment of eye contact, I saw something I had rarely seen from him: uncertainty. "How much time do I have?" It was the question every surgeon dreaded asking, and every anesthesiologist dreaded answering. How much time before the patient's body could no longer sustain life? How much time before all our skills and technology and determination became irrelevant? I looked at the monitors, calculating medications and vital signs and the rate of deterioration, trying to give him an honest assessment that wouldn't cause panic, but would convey the seriousness of the situation. Not much. "Her body's shutting down. We need a miracle, Jonathan." The words were out of my mouth before I realized I had said them. In 12 years of practicing medicine, I had never used that word in an operating room. Medicine was about science, about evidence, about interventions that could be measured and predicted. Miracles were for other people, for other places, for conversations that happened outside the sterile environment where I worked. But as I looked at Sarah Williams lying unconscious on the operating table, her body failing despite everything we were doing to save her, I realized that science might not be enough. All my training, all my experience, all my sophisticated equipment was telling me the same thing. This woman was about to leave her children without a mother, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. That's when I remembered her word. I need you to watch for something beyond what the machines can tell you. I had no idea that in the next few minutes, I was about to witness something that would force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the relationship between medicine and the impossible. What happened next defied every law of medicine I had ever learned. I was reaching for the epinephrine, the last resort medication that might restart Sarah's failing cardiovascular system, when something made me pause. It wasn't a sound or a visual cue from the monitors. It was something else, something I had never experienced in an operating room before. The chaos around me seemed to slow down. Not literally, of course. Dr. Mitchell was still working frantically to complete the procedure. Nurse Johnson was still moving efficiently between surgical instruments. The monitors were still screaming their urgent warnings about Sarah's deteriorating condition. But somehow, in the middle of all that controlled panic, I felt a moment of absolute stillness. And in that stillness, I heard Sarah's voice as clearly as if she were awake and speaking directly to me. "Keep your eyes open for more than just numbers." I looked down at her face, peaceful, despite everything her body was enduring, and something compelled me to check her vital signs one more time before administering the emergency medication. That's when I saw it. Her heart rate, which had been chaotic and irregular for the past several minutes, was beginning to stabilize. Not dramatically. The change was so subtle that if I hadn't been watching with laser focus, I would have missed it entirely. But the wild fluctuations were settling into a more rhythmic pattern. "Wait," I said, my hand frozen over the epinephrine. "Something's changing." Dr. Mitchell looked up from his work, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the operating room. "What kind of changing?" I stared at the cardiac monitor, hardly believing what I was seeing. "Her heart rhythm. It's stabilizing." "That's not possible," Dr. Mitchell said, but his voice carried more hope than skepticism. "She was in complete cardiac distress 30 seconds ago." I checked the blood pressure monitor next. The reading that had been dangerously low was slowly, incrementally climbing back toward normal range. Not quickly enough to be explained by any medication I had given her. I hadn't given her anything, but steadily enough to be undeniable. "Blood pressure's coming up too," I announced, my voice barely concealing my amazement. 70 over 40, 75 over 45, 80 over 50. Nurse Johnson moved closer to look at the monitors herself, her expression shifting from professional concern to something approaching wonder. "How is that possible? What did you give her?" "Nothing," I said, and the word hung in the air like a confession. "I didn't give her anything. This is happening on its own." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't quite accurate. This wasn't happening on its own. This was happening for reasons that my medical training had never prepared me to understand or explain. Dr. Mitchell had stopped working entirely now, his attention focused on the impossible recovery taking place right in front of us. "Ben, her color's improving too." He was right. Sarah's skin, which had been taking on the grayish pallor that indicated poor circulation, was regaining its healthy pink tone. Her lips, which had been turning blue from lack of oxygen, were returning to their normal color. I checked her oxygen saturation levels. They were climbing steadily. 85%, 87%, 90%, 93%. Numbers that should have been impossible given her lung function just minutes earlier. "This doesn't make medical sense," I said, but I was smiling as I said it. "Everything about this is completely impossible." And yet, it was happening. Her respiratory rate, which had been shallow and labored, deepened and became more regular. The ventilator, which had been working overtime to force oxygen into struggling lungs, suddenly seemed almost unnecessary as her body began breathing more naturally on its own. "Look at her EKG," Nurse Johnson whispered, pointing to the screen that displayed Sarah's heart rhythm. "It's perfect. Like textbook perfect." She was right. The chaotic, irregular pattern that had been indicating potential heart failure had transformed into the kind of steady, strong rhythm you'd expect to see in someone 20 years younger with no health problems at all. "Doctor." Mitchell and I exchanged a look across the operating table, a look that acknowledged we were witnessing something that would be impossible to explain in any medical journal, something that challenged the very foundations of everything we thought we knew about human physiology. "How long has it been since her vitals crashed?" he asked quietly. I checked the surgical clock on the wall. 4 minutes, maybe 5. "And how long does it typically take for someone to recover from that level of cardiovascular distress?" The question hung between us because we both knew the answer. Patients didn't recover from that level of distress, not without massive medical intervention, not without a team of specialists and emergency procedures and medications that could have serious side effects, and certainly not in 5 minutes. But Sarah Williams was doing exactly that. Her blood pressure had stabilized at levels that were not just acceptable, but optimal. Her heart rate had settled into a strong, steady rhythm. Her oxygen levels were better than they had been since before the surgery began. Every single vital sign that had been indicating imminent system failure was now reading normal. "Dr. Mitchell," I said slowly, "I think you can finish the surgery." He looked at me with an expression of complete bewilderment mixed with profound relief. "Are you sure? What if she crashes again?" I looked at Sarah's peaceful face, remembering her absolute certainty that she would be going home to her children, and I felt something I had never felt in an operating room before. Complete confidence in something I couldn't explain. "She's not going to crash," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "Look at these numbers, Jonathan. She's not just stable. She's stronger than she was when we started." And she was. Every parameter I was monitoring indicated that Sarah Williams had somehow moved from the brink of clinical demise to a state of physiological stability that was actually superior to her condition at the beginning of the surgery. Dr. Mitchell resumed his work, but I could see the wonder in his eyes as he continued the procedure. "In 30 years of surgery," he said quietly, "I have never seen anything like this." Neither had I. But as I watched Sarah's vital signs remain perfectly stable for the remainder of the procedure, I began to understand what she had been trying to tell me in her hospital room. There were indeed things that happened in operating rooms that had nothing to do with blood pressure and heart rate, nothing to do with medications and monitors and medical expertise. There were moments when something beyond science stepped into sterile rooms and reminded everyone present that life, at its core, was still a mystery that couldn't be reduced to numbers on a screen. The surgery continued without incident. Dr. Mitchell completed the complex procedure with the kind of precision and skill that had made him one of the best surgeons in Georgia. But we both knew that surgical skill wasn't what had saved Sarah Williams. Something else had intervened in operating room 3 that night. Something that had heard the desperate prayers of a mother who needed to go home to make pancakes for her children. Something that had responded to a love so fierce and a determination so absolute that it had literally brought her back from the edge of losing everything. As we prepared to move Sarah to recovery, her vital signs still impossibly perfect, I realized I was no longer the same doctor who had walked into this operating room 2 hours earlier. I was still a skilled anesthesiologist, still someone who understood the science of keeping people alive during surgery. But I was also now someone who had witnessed firsthand that sometimes, when science reaches the limits of what it can accomplish, there are other forces ready to step in and complete the work. And as I watched Sarah's chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of someone who was very much alive and very much going home to her family, I understood that I had been given a gift that would change not just my medical practice, but my entire understanding of what was possible in this world. 2 hours later, as Sarah Williams was wheeled into the recovery room with vital signs that any medical textbook would describe as perfect, I found myself standing outside the surgical waiting area, staring through the glass doors at her family. I had delivered post-surgery updates to families thousands of times in my career, but I had never felt the weight of what I was about to share quite like this. Marcus Williams was still in the same position I had seen him in hours earlier, hunched forward with his hands clasped together. But now his eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion and worry, his face carrying the hollow look of someone who had been preparing himself for the worst possible news. Jasmine had fallen asleep curled up in her chair, her teddy bear still clutched against her chest, tear stains visible on her cheeks even in sleep. Caleb had finally stopped pacing and was sitting beside his father, both of them staring at the doors where they expected either Dr. Mitchell or me to emerge with news that would change their lives forever. They had been waiting for nearly 4 hours, and I knew that every minute of that wait had been filled with the kind of fear that only families in hospital waiting rooms truly understand. The fear that comes from knowing that someone you love more than your own life is fighting a battle you can't see, in a place you can't go, with odds that nobody wants to discuss honestly. Dr. Mitchell had offered to deliver the update. It was usually the surgeon's responsibility. But something made me ask if I could do it instead. Maybe it was because I had been the one Sarah had spoken to about her children. Maybe it was because I had been the one who witnessed what happened in that operating room. Or maybe it was simply because I needed to see their faces when they learned that sometimes, against all medical logic, mothers do get to come home to make Sunday morning pancakes. I pushed open the doors and walked toward them, and immediately all three of them were on their feet, their faces a mixture of desperate hope and terrifying anticipation. "Mr. Williams," I said, and my voice caught slightly on the words. After everything I had witnessed, after the impossible recovery I had seen with my own eyes, I was still overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was about to tell them. "How is she?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Dr. Hayes, just tell me. Is my wife—" "She's alive," I said quickly, seeing the panic in his eyes. "She's alive, and she's stable, and she's going to be fine." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I watched as my words registered, as hope tentatively replaced fear, as three people who had been bracing themselves for devastation slowly began to understand that they weren't going to lose the most important person in their world. And then Jasmine broke. She collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing with a mixture of relief and exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude that shook her entire body. Marcus wrapped his arms around both his children, and I could see tears streaming down his face as he held them close, whispering, "She's okay, she's okay, she's okay," over and over like a prayer of thanksgiving. "But how?" Caleb asked through his tears, looking up at me with eyes that were too young to have experienced this kind of fear. "The doctor said it was really dangerous. They said there were complications." I knelt down to his level, remembering my own children and how desperately they would want honest answers in a situation like this. "There were complications, Caleb. Very serious ones. For a while during the surgery, we were very worried about your mom." "What happened?" Marcus asked, his arms still around his children, but his attention fully focused on me. This was the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading. How do you explain to a family that their wife and mother was essentially dying on the operating table, that every medical indicator suggested she wouldn't survive, and then she simply didn't die? How do you describe something that challenges the fundamental assumptions of medical science without sounding like you've lost your mind? "Your wife," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, "is an extraordinary woman. During the surgery, her body was under tremendous stress. Her vital signs became very unstable, and for several minutes we were genuinely concerned that we might lose her." I paused, seeing the fear return to their faces as they processed what I was telling them. But then something happened that I've never seen before in my 12 years as an anesthesiologist. Her body recovered. Not gradually, not with medical intervention, but suddenly and completely. Her heart rate stabilized, her blood pressure normalized, her oxygen levels improved. Every single vital sign went from critical to normal in a matter of minutes. Marcus stared at me, trying to process what I was saying. "I don't understand. How is that possible?" "Medically speaking," I said honestly, "it's not possible. What happened in that operating room defies every principle of medicine I've ever learned. By all rights, given her condition during the crisis, your wife should not have survived." "But she did," Jasmine whispered, wiping tears from her eyes. "She did," I confirmed, smiling at her. "And not only did she survive, but she finished the surgery stronger than when we started. Her vital signs right now are better than they were before the operation began." The three of them looked at each other, and I could see them struggling to understand how something that sounded impossible could be true. "Dr. Hayes," Marcus said finally, "are you telling me that what happened to Sarah was some kind of miracle?" The word hung in the air between us. In medical school, they don't teach you how to discuss miracles with families. They teach you to stick to facts, to evidence, to explanations that can be quantified and measured. They certainly don't teach you to stand in hospital waiting rooms and acknowledge that sometimes things happen that science cannot explain. But as I looked at this family, a father who had been preparing to raise his children alone, a teenage girl who had been ready to lose her mother, a boy who might have grown up without the woman who sang off-key in the car and made pancakes with chocolate chip smiley faces, I realized that honesty was more important than medical protocol. "Mr. Williams," I said, "I've been practicing medicine for 12 years. I've seen thousands of surgeries, thousands of complications, thousands of recoveries. I have never seen anything like what happened to your wife today." I paused, making sure I had their complete attention. "Your wife told me before the surgery that she wasn't afraid because she knew she was going to come home to make pancakes for her children. She told me that some promises get made in places deeper than operating rooms. At the time, I thought she was just being optimistic." Marcus smiled through his tears. "That sounds like Sarah." "Well," I continued, "I want you to know that your wife was right, about everything. What happened in that operating room today wasn't medical science. It was something else entirely. Something that heard a mother's promise to her children and made sure she could keep it." We stood there in silence for a moment, all of us processing the magnitude of what had occurred. Then Jasmine asked the question I had been hoping she would ask. "When can we see her?" "She's in recovery now," I said, checking my watch. "She should be waking up in about an hour. You can see her then." "And she's really going to be okay?" Caleb asked, still needing reassurance. "She's going to be fine," I said with complete confidence. "In fact, she's going to be better than fine. Your mom is going home tomorrow, and if I know her, she'll be making pancakes by Sunday morning." As I walked away from the Williams family, leaving them to process the impossible news that their wife and mother had somehow cheated death itself, I realized that I would never be able to practice medicine the same way again. I had spent my entire career believing that healing was about science, about medications and procedures and interventions that could be measured and predicted. But Sarah Williams had taught me that sometimes the most powerful medicine has nothing to do with drugs or surgery. Sometimes the most powerful medicine is love that refuses to give up, hope that defies logic, and promises made by mothers who simply will not leave their children behind. And as I headed home to my own family, to my own children who would never know how close they had come to having a father who no longer believed in impossible things, I knew that I would carry this night with me for the rest of my life. 3 months have passed since that extraordinary night in Operating Room 3, and I find myself thinking about Sarah Williams almost every day. Not because the medical mystery of what happened continues to puzzle me, though it certainly does, but because her case fundamentally changed the way I understand my role as a doctor and as a human being. Sarah made a full recovery. Better than full, actually. When she came in for her follow-up appointment 6 weeks after surgery, her test results were so perfect that Dr. Mitchell joked we should bottle whatever had happened to her and prescribe it to all our patients. Her incisions healed without complications. Her energy returned completely. And according to Marcus, she was indeed making Sunday morning pancakes with chocolate chip smiley faces within a week of coming home. But the most remarkable thing wasn't her physical recovery. It was the way she looked at me during that follow-up visit, with eyes that held a quiet knowing, as if to say, "I told you so, Dr. Hayes. I told you to watch for something beyond what the machines could measure." She never directly referenced what had happened in the op. She didn't need to. We both knew that we had shared something that transcended the typical doctor-patient relation, something that had challenged the boundaries between medical science and the unexplainable mysteries of human. That experience has rippled through every aspect of my practice since. I still rely on my training, still monitor vital signs with the same precision, still make the same calculated decisions about medications and procedures that have guided my career for 12 years. But now, I also listen for something else. Something that exists in the spaces between heartbeats. Something that speaks in a language deeper than the beeping of monitors. Last week, I had a case that reminded me why this new perspective matters so much. An elderly man, 78 years old, came in for a routine procedure that should have been straightforward. But during surgery, his body began struggling in ways that felt familiar. His vital signs became erratic, his blood pressure dropped, his heart rhythm grew irregular. The old Dr. Hayes would have focused entirely on the medical interventions, on the medications and adjustments that might stabilize his condition. But the new Dr. Hayes, the one who had witnessed Sarah Williams defy every law of medicine, also paid attention to something else. I noticed the way this man had squeezed his wife's hand before going under anesthesia. I heard him whisper to her, "I'll see you soon, sweetheart. 60 years together isn't enough." I saw the wedding ring he refused to remove, even for surgery, because he had promised her 58 years ago that he would never take it off. And when his vital signs began to crash, I found myself thinking not just about epinephrine and cardiac support, but about a man who had made a promise to his wife that 60 years together wasn't enough. I found myself believing that sometimes promises like that have a power that extends beyond what medical science can measure or explain. His recovery wasn't as dramatic as Sarah's had been. There was no sudden, impossible reversal of critical vital signs. But there was something, a steadiness, a determination in his body's response to treatment, that told me his promise to his wife was playing a role in his healing that would never show up in any medical journal. He went home 3 days later, and when I saw him walking out of the hospital holding his wife's hand, I understood that I had witnessed another moment where love and medicine had worked together in ways that my textbooks had never taught me to recognize. This is what Sarah Williams gave me that night in Operating Room 3. Not just the memory of an impossible recovery, but a new way of seeing the intersection between science and the human spirit. She taught me that being a good doctor isn't just about mastering medical techniques. It's about remaining open to the possibility that healing happens on levels we don't fully understand. I think about the doctor I was before that night. So confident in my ability to reduce everything to numbers and data points. So certain that emotion had no place in the sterile environment where I worked. That doctor was competent, but he was also limited by his refusal to acknowledge that patients are more than the sum of their vital signs. The doctor I am now is still committed to medical excellence, but he's also willing to recognize that sometimes the most important factor in a patient's recovery isn't the medication I give them or the procedure we perform. Sometimes it's the strength of their connection to the people who need them to come home. Sometimes it's the power of promises made by mothers who refuse to leave their children behind. Sometimes it's the determination of husbands who believe that 60 years of marriage isn't enough. I've started paying attention to these things in ways I never did before. When I talk to patients before surgery, I listen not just to their medical concerns, but to their reasons for fighting. I notice the photos they bring from home, the way they talk about their families, the promises they make about what they'll do when they recover. And I've learned that these details aren't just emotionally touching stories that happen alongside the real medical work. They are part of the real medical work. They are factors that influence outcomes in ways that are real and measurable, even if they can't be quantified in the same way as blood pressure or heart rate. Sarah Williams showed me that there are moments in medicine when everything we think we know reaches its limit, and something else steps in to complete the work we've started. She taught me that the best doctors aren't those who deny these moments exist, but those who remain humble enough to recognize them when they happen. I don't fully understand what occurred in Operating Room 3 that night. I probably never will. But I no longer need to understand it to know that it was real, that it was significant, and that it changed not just Sarah's life but mine as well. Now, when I walk into an operating room, I carry with me not just my medical knowledge and my technical skills, but also my willingness to witness miracles. Because I've learned that medicine at its best isn't just about saving lives. It's about being present for the mysterious, beautiful, impossible moments when life saves itself. And sometimes, when I'm monitoring a patient's vital signs and watching for changes that might require my intervention, I remember Sarah Williams' words, "Keep your eyes open for more than just numbers." I always do now, and my patients are better for it. So I have to ask you, have you ever witnessed something that challenged everything you thought you knew about what's possible? Have you ever seen love triumph over logic, hope overcome medical odds, or faith move mountains that science said couldn't be moved? Because if you have, then you know what I learned that night. That we live in a world where impossible things happen every day, and the people who recognize them are the ones who understand that miracles aren't the exception to the rules of life. They're a reminder that some rules are bigger than we ever imagined.